What is our common bond truly? Freedom.
I hereby declare this to be an unlawful assembly. I order all those assembled to immediately disperse.
And it's the only thing that it's all about, nothing else.
The old way is in the certain process of destruction, and a new world order is beating down the door.
February 1956. In the heart of New York, Operation Big City was underway. A Ford Mercury, specially adapted with a hidden exhaust pipe, pumped out bacteria onto the streets of Manhattan. Undercover agents entered the city's subway system, their cases equipped with tiny motors, which covertly dispersed the bacteria Bacillus globuli. 10 years later, the Army returned. Light bulbs filled with bacteria were dropped in front of trains and down ventilation shafts to test how far the bacteria would spread through the subway system. For years, these public experiments were kept secret from the citizens of New York. The Army faithfully filmed its own experiments. This Washington, D.C. bus station was the site of another secret test. 30 similar trials were conducted at public locations all across America. One of the earliest experiments had fatal consequences. In 1951, the Army sprayed the bacteria Serratia marcescens over San Francisco. 11 hospital patients developed a mysterious infection, and within days, Edward Nevin died from an illness caused by the same bacteria. In 1953, CIA employee Frank Olson leaped through his bedroom window on the 10th floor of this New York hotel. 9 days earlier, a fellow CIA scientist had secretly spiked his drink with LSD. It took the government 22 years to acknowledge its role in Frank Olson's death. Another cover-up concerned the death of a civilian, Harold Blower. Suffering from depression, he was a patient at the New York State Psychiatric Institute. There, he and 5 other patients were unwittingly tested with mind-altering drugs by doctors who'd signed a secret contract with the U.S. Army. Again, it was more than 20 years before his family discovered the truth.
In 1975, I was living in California with my 2 children, and there was a knock on the door, and 2 people in uniform were at the door. They said they were from the Pentagon, and they wanted to talk to me about the death of my father. And I told them that my father had been dead a long time. They came in and they told me that they had found papers at the Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland, and these papers had information about my father's death.
It took Harold Blower's family 15 years of fighting the government in court before a judge's ruling established the facts.
On January 8th, 1953, between 9:53 and 9:57 a.m., my father was injected with 450 milligrams, or 6.47 milligrams kilograms of body weight of EA-1298. According to the drug study notes, at 9:57, my father became very restless and had to be restrained by the nurse. He began sweating profusely and flailing his arms wildly. At 10:01, he pulled up in bed, his body stiffened, his teeth clenched, and he began frothing at the mouth. Similar reactions continued for over an hour. My father was still talking and moving his legs randomly at 11:05. Finally, at about 1.5 hours after the injection had begun, my father lapsed into a coma. He was pronounced dead at 12:15 p.m.
Go ahead. Biological testing involving human subjects by the Department of Defense. And in here, talks about the initial capacity for producing bacterial agents was later expanded to include capabilities for producing toxin in addition to viral and rickettsial agents, and the unique capacity for growing and infecting mosquitoes with viral agents.
So there was a bioweapon, it was Lyme disease.
Oh, they've been playing with all this stuff. Yeah, that's where West Nile came from.
Yep.
They did all the studies in here. And this is interesting because they go into a restaurant and take a hypodermic needle and inject LSD into the wine bottle. You sit there and have your dinner.
And that was when?
This is
Human drug test?
by the CIA, yeah.
1977?
Yep.
Okay. And what?
Everything, there's so much in here, it's just...
How'd you get that report?
It's requisitioned.
Requisitioned how?
People just got their hands on it.
Oh, yeah? And that's probably on the internet, right?
Yeah, not the whole thing. You can get parts of it. Like the 103rd Congress is biological chemical weapons we sold to Iraq.
Yeah.
That's when he was at war with Iran, firing missiles and weapons and killing over 1 million Iranians, but now we got to go after them.
Well, it'd be interesting to get some of that as a PDF or whatever file.
Yep.
Thank you very much for holding this committee meeting, and again, thank you for the very nice introduction. You've heard today that there are many problems in the field of Lyme disease, and I wanted to address one of the core problems that you may not be aware of. Some have called this the Lyme disease conspiracy. There's in this country a core group of university-based Lyme disease researchers and physicians whose opinions carry a great deal of weight. Unfortunately, many of them act unscientifically and unethically. They exert strong, ethically questionable influence on medical journals, which enables them to publish and to promote articles that are badly flawed. They work with government agencies to bias consensus meetings and have worked to exclude from these meetings and scientific seminars those with alternate opinions. They behave this way for reasons of personal or professional gain and are involved in obvious conflicts of interest. Some of them are known to have received large consulting fees from insurance companies to advise the companies to curtail coverage of any additional therapy beyond their empiric 30-day course. This group promotes the idea that Lyme is a simple, rare illness that is easy to avoid, difficult to acquire, simple to diagnose, and easily treated and cured with 30 days or less of antibiotics. The truth, however, is that Lyme is the fastest growing illness in this country after AIDS, infectious illness after AIDS, with a cost to society measured in the billions of dollars. It can be acquired by anyone who goes outdoors, very often goes undiagnosed for months, years, or even forever in some patients, and can render the patient chronically ill and even totally disabled, despite what this core group of physicians refers to as, quotes, adequate therapy. Long-term studies on patients who were undertreated or untreated demonstrated the occurrence of severe illness more than a decade later, reminiscent of the findings of the notorious Tuskegee study. Following the lead of this group of physicians, a few state health departments have now begun to investigate in a very threatening way physicians who have more liberal views on Lyme disease diagnosis and treatment than they do. And indeed, I have to confess that today I feel that I am taking a personal risk, a large one, because I'm stating these views publicly for fear that I may suffer some repercussions, despite the fact that many hundreds of physicians and many thousands of patients all over the world agree with what I'm saying here today.
They were working with it when it mysteriously popped up, and it can cause death. I have death certificates and a whole bunch of papers at home on that, but this one is United States Patent Office, and this is an invention, the pathogenic Mycoplasma fermentans incognitus. Now this one is patented by the Department of Defense. Many people say that this is what the Gulf War illness, that's what these guys are suffering from, because they all have the In fact, 70% of any chronic illness in the world, I guess, has the Mycoplasma infection. If you're chronic, whether it's MS, lupus, Parkinson's, whatever. The next page is a PubMed article. Another strain of Mycoplasma was made. This was made from everybody's favorite island, Plum Island. And it's highlighted. You'll see that on your TV. Plum Island worked with mycoplasmas. They worked with infecting ticks. They've done everything you could imagine. This one I may not be able to put on the screen, but it'll be on the website. This is UTSA, $10.6 million lab. They're going to be working with biowarfare agents. They'll be working with such diseases as anthrax, tularemia, cholera, Lyme disease, desert fever, and other parasitic and fungal diseases. Now, Lyme disease is listed with some of the most deadly pathogens known to man. Another one, the CSU, biological warfare, says some season will call what they're working with spooky microbes, infectious bugs, and weaponized biological agents. Among them, anthrax, SARS, avian influenza, tularemia, encephalitis, West Nile virus, Lyme disease, chronic wasting disease, plague, yellow fever. It just goes on. So what's the attraction with this Lyme disease if they tell you it's a cakewalk, it's so easy to get, so easy to cure, I'm sorry. Now, this is New England Journal of Medicine. They wouldn't even respond to me. But I have a paper here, The Long-Term Course of Lyme Arthritis in Children. The natural history of Lyme disease is not completely known. We studied the long-term course of Lyme arthritis in 46 children in whom the onset of disease occurred between 76 and 79, who received no antibiotic therapy for at least the first 4 years of the illness. Now, they're using the excuse that they didn't have a test, they didn't know what it was at that time. But the lab, I just showed you the lab they were working with, knew about it in 1975, 74, whatever. Down below it says all 46 children had positive IgG antibody responses to Borrelia burgdorferi throughout the illness. So that's the Lyme bacteria. They tested positive for it. And later on, the people got sick, later on lingering, they had IgM responses. Were significantly higher than the IgG titers. Another reason why the CDC doesn't want to use the IgM. You can Google, I won't put this on the screen, you can Google this one. This is the Tuskegee timeline. Go into Google, type in Tuskegee timeline. This is an experiment that the CDC did on the black Tuskegee soldiers. This went from 1932, ended in 1972. And the experiment ended when they died. When they died, the experiment was done. And when this came out, the news media finally caught on to it. Now that we're talking about Plum Island and experiments and whatever, the next thing on your screen is a paper from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They were investigating a man named Eric Traub. Eric Traub had bought some land in Maryland. He was putting fuel tanks in, underground fuel tanks. I believe he had a generator. And if you read this, they were concerned that this guy was working to help overthrow the United States government. They felt that he was ready to help if there was an invasion into this country, that you would have fuel and radio and whatever they needed on this farm. So the next page, FBI, They're talking about, excuse me, they again installed more gas tanks, underground tanks. Subjects reported to have built a large home near the near the Frank DuPont estate, which has an airport. So they were concerned about that. The next page is, they're talking about Eric Traub being extremely pro-Nazi. So here's a guy that they were afraid was going to overthrow the United States government. The FBI, CIA were watching him because he's extremely pro-Nazi. Here's the papers that they brought him into the country to work at Plum Island. His job there was, one of the main things he did was infecting ticks. So this is the requisition to get him from Germany to the United States. Keep in mind, this is a guy that they're afraid is going to overthrow our government. They put him in charge of biowarfare on Plum Island. The next one is his photo, the National Defense Program, his photo, and his fingerprints when they brought him into the country. This is interesting. As you can see on your screen, I posted a $20,000 reward in 2003, I think. I canceled it. I pulled it in 2007. But it was interesting to see the emails that were generated. Again, thank you, Chris Newby, for the Freedom of Information emails that she filed, which took 5.5 years for her to get them. They had to censor everything. And in there, they're talking about the $20,000 reward. They were upset with me because I posted a reward. The only reason I did that was hoping the news media would say there's got to be something going on here. This guy's putting up 20 grand saying Lyme is not easy to cure. And I was really hoping the news media would do something, but they didn't. That was a big failure. So Hank Fader, we demanded that Hank Fader show us the test that they used to diagnose Lyme to say that Lyme is cured. That's why we were out there. We wanted him to come up with come up with a sign. I'm sorry, my brain's a little tired. They wanted him to come up with a sign, paper, document, whatever, explaining that Lyme is easy to cure. See what they're using, because we've already proven the Western blot is nothing. So this is from Phil Baker about the $20,000 reward and the protest at UConn. Why not take this as an opportunity to challenge them to provide unequivocal evidence to show those who believe that they have late chronic Lyme actually have a persistent Borrelia infection? Well, Phil, does it really matter if you have a persistent infection or chronic Lyme? That's like calling somebody a chronic alcoholic or a drunk. You still have an infection and you don't have a test to prove it. So you can't use the word chronic Lyme is not real. Here's one from Henry Fader from UConn. I think the key is to not debate the chronic Lyme disease science with the patient. We cannot prove the patient does not have chronic Lyme disease. So he's admitted we have no test. This is from Derlin Fish. This is a good one. This is how you treat your taxpayers. The battle cannot be won on a scientific front. Derlin Fish is admitting they don't have the science. We have the science proving that Lyme is not easy to cure. There's no test for it. The battle cannot be won on a scientific front. We need to mount a socio-political offensive, but we're outnumbered and outgunned. We need reinforcements from outside the field. That's a nice way to treat the people that are paying taxes. And this one is also from Alan Steer. There's one point that I would like to emphasize in untreated patients. He means people that weren't treated immediately, which is 80–90% of the people, because your doctor can't see a positive test, you don't get treated. Alan Steer says, there is a chronic form of Lyme disease that commonly results in Lyme arthritis or in rare cases, Lyme encephalitis, Lyme, neurological Lyme.
I was a research scientist at the Plum Island Animal Disease Center from 1960 to 1983. We worked on a covert biological warfare program even after Nixon ended all offensive aspects of the bioweapons program. We engineered human embryos and tested their resistance towards the enhanced diseases we created. The security conditions at the laboratory were not the best, and there were numerous instances of disease spreading to nearby communities, and we were responsible for all the cover-ups. People have a right to know, and I have a responsibility to tell them what went on there. Dr. Traub's initial research at Plum Island focused on the tick and their ability to spread disease to the enemy. Our team continued his research suspicious of the sudden appearance of a previously unknown disease and began to question our activities at Plum Island. This man's name was Dr. Herman von Buchholz, and his disappearance went unnoticed by the media. We could not risk having our biowarfare program exposed. Eventually, the warfare research facilities at Plum Island were shut down, and we were debriefed and dismissed with warnings to never discuss what went on there.
Hello world, we are anonymous. Through the practice of biological warfare, human beings have used disease as a weapon for centuries. Yet many conspiracists believe the practice continues into the modern age. First, let's begin with a discussion of what properties constitute an effective biological warfare agent. The media, the Centers for Disease Control and the Department of Defense would have us believe that the most threatening biological agents are lethal microbes which cause acute disease and then death, such as anthrax and smallpox. It appears that we are being intentionally misled as to where the real danger lies. Government biological warfare documents speak of incapacitating agents as being the most effective at disabling a nation. When a population is infected with a lethal agent, it is very obvious that measures need to be taken such as quarantine, antibiotics, etc. This helps to curb and abort the epidemic. A much more discreet, diabolical, and effective method of disabling a country would be to employ a moderately infectious organism or combination which would pass slowly through the population unnoticed. Some of the criteria for effective disabling agents are: 1. A biological agent which lacks objective signs that can be determined by medical testing. Many patients who are extremely ill with mycoplasma or Lyme infections are told all their tests are normal, therefore their problems must be all in their heads. Many people labeled with chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia are told the same thing: if they would only get a new job, hobby, or begin to exercise, then they would be fine. 2. An agent which would produce so many symptoms throughout the body that it would appear that the patient was malingering or faking. This criteria prevents the medical community from taking the disease seriously, and in the meantime it passes quietly through the population, being labeled as many separate diseases and conditions. 3. If the disabling agent is a combination of several diseases, some of which could be genetically engineered, then it becomes very difficult if not impossible to diagnose and treat. 4. Diseases which are spread by insect vectors are very much sought after. This makes an epidemic much easier to pass off as a natural event while concealing the identity of the perpetrators. Documented evidence proves that the biological weapons they were developing were tested on the public in various communities without their knowledge or consent. The government knew that crystalline brucella would cause disease in humans. Now they needed to determine how it would spread and the best way to disperse it. They tested dispersal methods for Brucella sui and Brucella melitensis at Dugway Proving Ground, Utah, in June and September 1952. Probably, 100% of us now are infected with Brucella sui and Brucella melitensis. 8. Another government document recommended the genesis of open-air vulnerability tests and covered research and development programs to be conducted by the Army and supported by the Central Intelligence Agency. At that time, the Government of Canada was asked by the U.S. government to cooperate in testing weaponized Brucella, and Canada cooperated fully with the United States. The U.S. government wanted to determine whether mosquitoes would carry the disease and also if the air would carry it. A government report stated that open-air testing of infectious biological agents is considered essential to an ultimate understanding of biological warfare potentialities because of the many unknown factors affecting the degradation of microorganisms in the atmosphere. The U.S. Army actually conducted a series of simulated germ warfare tests over Winnipeg. The Pentagon lied about the tests to the mayor, saying that they were testing a chemical fog over the city, which would protect Winnipeg in the event of a nuclear attack. A report commissioned by U.S. Congress, chaired by Dr. Rogine Henderson, lists 32 American towns and cities used as test sites as well. The AIDS pathogen was created out of a Brucella bacterium mutated with a virus, then the toxin was removed as a DNA particle called a mycoplasma. They used the same mycoplasma to develop disabling diseases like MS, Crohn's colitis, Lyme disease, etc. In the previously mentioned U.S. congressional document of a meeting held on June 9, 1969, the Pentagon delivered a report to Congress about biological weapons. The Pentagon stated, "We are continuing to develop disabling weapons." Dr. MacArthur, who was in charge of the research, said, "We are developing a new lethal weapon, a synthetic biological agent that does not naturally exist, and for which no natural immunity could have been acquired. When a large portion of the population is sick and unable to work, this puts an enormous strain on the economy. I predict that if we do not make this issue an immediate priority, our country will indeed become quickly disabled." The next logical question would be, does Lyme disease and its co-infections fit into this situation? Certain doctors and researchers feel that Lyme disease and its co-infections, such as Mycoplasma fermentans, patented by the U.S. Army, are actually MICR organisms with excellent credentials for qualifying as disabling biowarfare agents. Much controversy surrounds the diagnosis and treatment of Lyme disease and mycoplasma-induced illnesses such as Gulf War illness. Professor Garth Nicholson and Lieutenant Joyce Riley, among others, are seeing evidence everywhere that one cause of Gulf War illness is microbial and that it is spreading to the families of the veterans and then on to the public in general. Many who become ill with this mycoplasma and/or the Lyme spirochete are being divided up into separate disease labels such as multiple sclerosis, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, Alzheimer's, bipolar depression, lupus, ALS, etc. Most of these disease labels have no known definitive tests, causes, or cures, only symptomatic treatments. We are anonymous. We are legion. We do not forgive the government for their crimes. We will never forget those who suffer from them. To those that hurt others for their own gain, expect us.